Hello. So we're going to be talking about functions today and a very brief introduction to functions, why we need them, why we use them, and how to use them. So already have my HTML set up, my scripts, as usual, all set up. So what are functions? Let's start with what functions are. So functions are basically reusable pieces of code, right? You can think of them as sub-programs, um, within your program. So while when you write code, usually you write code to do something, but there are some times where you have a group of things that you do. You might do them often enough, or they might be unique enough that you can group them together. For example, let's think of, if I was to give a real life example, probably when you wake up in the morning, you have a certain function you execute. Let's call that get ready for work, right? So this function, you have like certain steps you take. Your steps could be, okay, get up from the bed, maybe say a prayer, um, brush, shower, get dressed, have breakfast, and then step out of the house. Now, this is something you do every day, right? It becomes a routine, it becomes like a full package on its own that you do every day. So we can encapsulate that particular behavior, that group of actions you take, as a function that we call get ready for work. So anytime we, like when it's morning, when you wake up and you need to get ready for work, when you need to get prepared, you're literally just going to call that function, and then it just runs everything. Not entirely applicable, but that should give you a sort of mental picture. So functions basically work the same way, and it doesn't just have to be for something big, right? Ideally your function should do just one thing. By when we say do just one thing, it doesn't mean it has to just be literally one thing, but it should have a purpose, like a single purpose. For example, in the get ready for work function that I said about preparing when you wake up, the purpose is to wake up and then do the things you need to do to be set for work, right? Then when you get to work, you could have another function you execute for what you have to do at work. You could have another function you execute when you get back home from work, which could be maybe to take a shower, take a nap, get something to eat, right? So the idea is functions are blocks of code grouped together that do something in particular, and we declare functions using the function keyword, right? And then we give it a name. This name could be anything. Well, so I'll just go with the example I said. Then it has brackets and this. So this is a function declaration, and in here um, we would have blocks of code, right? So we define functions so that we can encapsulate behavior and reuse them. The idea of function is to make your code reusable, split complex problems into smaller problems, and also generally make it easier to maintain your code. Because if, for example, let's think of your ideal day. You have a get ready for work function, you have a what I do at work function, you have a return from work function, right? And these functions are um, isolated in the sense that they are doing a particular thing. So if, for example, maybe you decide to update your get ready for work function, let's say maybe you're big on gymming now, so you decide that, okay, each morning I'm going to take a jog first. I'm going to get up earlier, take a jog before I shower and do the rest. We can change just our get ready for work function, and then every other function still works. So ultimately these functions make up your day, right? But since we split your days into reusable bits or reusable blocks of actions, it's possible for us to modify a part of the day without having to affect the entire day, without having to change the entire thing. which would be different if our program was just all over the place and we didn't have a structure in, like a structure of actions or things we do. So basically, functions make it easier for you to understand your code, easier for you to debug, easier for you to maintain, update, reuse, right? So this is how we declare functions. And after declaring a function, functions are a bit different from what we've been doing so far. So when you declare a function, it's just like saying, okay, this is something I'd like to do. Without calling the function, it doesn't actually do anything. So let's test this and say my first function. I'll change this to my first function, right? So within this function, we're only doing one thing now, which is to log my first function to the console. But if we come here, it doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't show. Let's remove this. It doesn't show anything. Nothing shows here, and this is because we have not yet called the function or invoked it. So the thing about functions is that when you declare a function, you just like, it's just like saying, okay, or think of it as declaring a variable. When you declare a variable, if you don't use it or assign it or log it to the console, it's just going to be there. You don't actually see it. You don't do anything with it. So to call functions or to execute functions, you type the function's name and attach parentheses. So this is how we call functions. And if we go back to our console now we should see this. So what happens is we've declared our function, we've declared what the function should do. We could have any amount of things in here, and when we call the function, what happens is it takes it transfers control back to the function, and then it executes whatever is enclosed in the function, right? So and then we see this. So this should give you an idea of what functions are. So now what can we actually do with functions? Well, it's completely up to you. Depending on what you want your function to do, all you need to do is put in that block of code, or put in those lines of code that can do what you want to do within your function, and then call your function whenever you want. Another thing about functions is that functions can accept parameters. So parameters are basically placeholders. Think of them as placeholder variables. Let's call this param1, param2, right? So basically parameters are placeholder variables. It's possible for you to have a function that has no parameters, like we just did. It doesn't take any argument, it doesn't take anything, it's self-enclosed, it just does what you need to do, right? But it's also possible for you to pass in data. For example, let's do this. Let's have a parameter called name, and let's change this function to be display name, right? So let's assume I want my function to say my name is whatever my name is, right? So this is a function that just displays name. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and this function accepts one parameter called name. So one thing to understand that is that the parameter is not literal. It doesn't mean you need to literally pass name like this when you're calling the function, right? This parameter is just a placeholder. It's just like saying, okay, I'm going to give you something, so what this thing I'm going to give you, refer to it as name temporarily, just for the time you're going to use it. Afterwards you dispose of it, right? So what you actually pass to the function is the data or the value that you intend to use. In this case, my name, which is Jeff, right? So what happens is that when I call this function with Jeff actually is substituted into name. Name is like a temporary variable that would now hold Jeff, and then when it logs that, I should see my name is Jeff. So just to recap, functions can take you can attach parameters to your function. Parameters are basically just placeholder or temporary variables that will hold data that you intend to give to the function to use in some way. Now when you're calling the function, you actually pass arguments. Arguments are the data themselves. It's fancy naming, but one thing to know is that you pass arguments to the function. Arguments are the actual data. Parameters are the temporary variables, the temporary placeholders that the function holds, because at the time of declaring the function, we don't have the actual value of what we want to use, so we have to use something that's like a variable, right? And this is what would then hold the value that will be passed as an argument to the function, right? So think of parameters as your placeholder variables and arguments as the actual data. Of course, the actual data you're sending can be a variable by itself. So if I decided to say let my name equals Jeff, I can pass in an actual variable here called my name. My name is still an argument, right? It's still, even though it's a variable, it's a variable that holds my name value, but this is still an argument, and this is a parameter, because this is a separate temporary variable that the function has to hold data that you pass to it. And you can your function can take numerous parameters depending on what you want to do. So let's, if I decided to say display, call this display information, I could have maybe parameters name, age, sex, and all of that, and then I would fit in all that data the same way, right? So I'll just pick this, and then, oh, sorry, I didn't change this name, right? So you see that here. So one thing to notice is that what you're passing here, see, like I passed an argument containing the variable my name, right? I passed this argument. That doesn't mean within the function I'm going to say my name. No, what I'm using in the function is the parameter that I declared, which is that temporary variable, which is going to be in the position of whatever I passed. So the first argument I'm passing to my function is automatically going to be substitute for this. The second argument to substitute, and basically they just substitute in the corresponding positions, right? So this is like the basics of functions, how to declare a function, how to execute or call the function. This is just one way of declaring a function. You have function expressions, you have arrow functions, though we won't go into that or those, but you can read up on that later. Then one more thing, a function is able to return a value, and your value can be anything you want, really. So when you return a value from the function, right, I'll just explain so you see how well, let's see how this works. So if you check here, we don't actually see this, right? It doesn't show here. But if we decide to assign our function to a variable and then log that, we get to see this. So a return value is basically, just think of a function as a return value as something that is the final value of the function. Of course, this final thing, whatever you're returning, might not actually correspond with what, for example, this is it says yeah it works, it doesn't actually exactly correspond with this. I might actually, my function might be doing some mathematics and I still decide to return this. So basically, you're free to return whatever you want to return. But essentially, when you return a value from a function, this is like um, what the function passes back. If you decide to assign that function to a variable, that's what that variable is going to hold. It's something like after the function has finished executing all the expressions within it, this is its return, this is the value, this is its final value. And like I said, this final value may or may not make sense, but ideally you should have a return value that somehow corresponds to what you were doing inside, so that the logic is easy to follow. So yeah, return values are not mandatory. If you decide not to use a return value, that's completely fine. But in some cases, you might actually need to use a return value because you might want to use the return value of the function to do something else. Right. So let's write a simple function to test um, if you are underage, right? So we'll call this function check if underage, and it's going to accept one parameter called age, right? And here we're going to say if age is less than 18, return true, else return false. One thing to know about the return statement is that it terminates the function. So whenever the function encounters return, it automatically closes out, right? So I'll show an example of that after this, but for now let's just see how this works. So let's call the function check if underage and pass in an age of 15, and then let's assign this to a variable. Let's call it x for now, right? So if we log x, we see true, right? Because what happens is that it passes the argument 15 to the age parameter, and then our age parameter now holds 15, and then it checks if 15 is less than 18. Since 15 is less than 18, it actually returns true. But if we pass in let's say 25, this returns false, because in that case the if statement isn't true, so it would move to the else statement. Of course, this is just to kind of show you how we could do some things in an explicit form. Ideally, we could just say return age less than 18. We could just say return age less than 18. So why does this work? Well, we know that when it checks, the age less than 18 is already going to say true or false, right? So we could just return that value directly and it will still do the same thing. So going back to the if statement, just to show you how return works, we'll go back to 15. So let's say console log tests if this shows, and here we'll say console.log this won't show. So if you look at this, right, the first statement we log, test if this shows, actually shows here, but this other statement, this won't show, doesn't show, because there's a return statement, and whenever a function encounters a return statement, it automatically exits. So this code that is after return is considered dead code, because this code can never be executed since it's after a return value. Once the function gets to return, it terminates the function, it closes it out. If I take this up here, then it shows, right? So you might be asking, if a function terminates once it sees return, how come we have two returns, right? So remember that this return is encapsulated or is enclosed in an if statement, right? So if this condition is not true, it won't ever, like, the code won't enter this block, and if it doesn't enter this block, it never gets to see this return statement, right? So to show you an example, let's say console.log, this can still show, assuming I change this age to 25, then that actually shows this can still show. And it shows because the return statement is enclosed in an if block, and since the condition is not true, then this is not going to it's not going to get to see this return statement. However, if I change this to 15, then that no longer shows. Why? Because it gets into the return and then it terminates. If I take out the return statement, you would see that both of them would show, because in the if block it executes this code and then comes out of the block to execute this, so both can show. So I hope that made things a bit clear. You can pass whatever you want to a function. Sorry, it could be an array, it could be an object, strings, anything basically.